According to the series editor, Jerry Conway, the idea for First Issue Special was to capitalize on the success of first issues with a series that was nothing but first issues. It sounds like a decent premise, but really, it was just a typical anthology series, much like DC's own Showcase series from the Silver Age. After 13 issues, First Issue Special came to an abrupt halt due to terrible sales. And for the most part, the series was forgotten amongst a pile of similar, experimental comics DC published during the mid-1970s. Only the 8th issue, which debuted Mike Grell's Warlord, achieved any notoriety. Otherwise, it was only memorable for containing some of the final work Jack Kirby did for DC while waiting for his contract to expire. Which brings us to 2023 and the miniseries Danger Street, written by Tom King and illustrated by Jorge Fornes. This miniseries uses all the characters that debuted in First Issue Special. Much like King did with Mr. Miracle, each issue title corresponds to the character that debuted in the same number issue of First Issue Special. So with Danger Street nearing its end, I decided to read through and review each issue of First Issue Special, get familiar with the various characters, and obtain a little more information about the foundation of that series before reading it. This turned into an interesting journey with some really weird Bronze Age ideas. So let's get into it. Atlas, edited, written, and drawn by Jack Kirby. Atlas the Great is a super strong warrior from an undetermined prehistoric era. He performs feats of strength and fights anyone who will challenge him. However, his entire purpose is to find the lizard-faced man who torched his village and took the life of everyone. His quest is aided by the suspicious man, Chagra, who offers to help Atlas in exchange for the location of something known as Crystal Mountain. The issue ends with Atlas confronting Hysa, the lizard-faced killer. Overall, it's not a compelling concept, and quite honestly, it does read like Kirby was not feeling inspired to give DC his best work. Especially since his contract was nearly at an end, the Fourth World Saga had been cancelled before its time, and Kamandi, which he also created, had been effectively taken away from him. So it reads like a contractual obligation more than anything. While the ending is a cliffhanger, it would be hard to presume Kirby intended to do anything beyond this one issue. The Green Team, written by Joe Simon, illustrated by Jerry Grandinetti. The issue opens on Abdul Smith, a young man with a shoeshine enterprise who wants to join the Millionaires Club. The members of that club laugh at that idea and suggest he join the Green Team. We're then introduced to the 3 teenage members of the Green Team: Commodore Murphy, a shipping tycoon, J.P. Houston, an oil magnate, and Cecil Sunbeam, a Hollywood producer. Despite their age, they are all ridiculously wealthy and obnoxious. When Abdul tries to join their team, he's informed he needs $1 million first. Abdul leaves, makes a deposit at the bank, and a banking error credits his account with $500,000. He takes the money and invests it, which instantly makes him a millionaire. He's then allowed on the Green Team. The team, who are venture capitalists, decide to fund the invention, the Great American Pleasure Machine, or GAP for short. However, a Broadway producer rallies an army to prevent this pleasure machine from being completed. This army surrounds the Green Team headquarters, preventing them from leaving. Meanwhile, the Broadway producer enters the Gap and spends a week inside. The story concludes with the man completely insane from this experience. Joe Simon, the former business partner of Jack Kirby and creator of Brother Power the Geek and Prez, returns to comics with a concept that is straight from the 1950s. It's truly something that is highly weird, with sensibilities from a different time. Oddly, it seems to be criticizing capitalism while also celebrating it. It's something that's really amusing, borderline manic, and so out of touch with reality that it's either a work of genius or straight up garbage. Metamorpho, written by Bob Haney, illustrated by Ramona Fradon. Metamorpho takes on Dr. Destiny, a 200-year-old ghost who is terrorizing various landmarks in Washington, D.C. It's a typical madcap romp done by the original co-creators of Metamorpho, and quite honestly, it reads like a lost tale from the original 1960s series. Like the Green Team, it's a story from a different time. It's not terrible, and Ramona Fradon is a terrific artist, but it does seem like filler material. Lady Cop, written by Robert Kanigher, illustrated by John Rosenberger. After witnessing the murder of her roommates, Liza Warner is inspired to become a cop. She wanders the mean streets of somewhere, primarily preventing female-oriented crime. This is a rather breezy read with a questionable subplot where Lady Cop is trying to find a woman she overheard talking about an STI. This subplot wraps up with a PSA about how an STI is treatable and it's not the end of the world. Also, every man Lady Cop confronts assaults her and throws in some misogynistic insults for good measure. It is some of the most awkward and flat writing one might encounter. The writer, Robert Kanigher, is probably best known for the numerous war stories he wrote for DC. However, he was also the writer who took over Wonder Woman when the creator, William Moulton Marston, suddenly passed away in 1947. In fact, he wrote the title for 20 straight years, so one would think a female character would be a perfect choice for him, but not so much. Sure, it tries to be an example of female empowerment, but it's filtered through the lens of a middle-aged man who probably doesn't buy into the notion of a woman being an equal. It also gives off a twisted romance comic vibe for some reason. And her boyfriend is less than supportive of her chosen profession, calling her a working man, which she corrects. I probably don't need to elaborate on the slang implication of the phrase, working woman. As a concept, it's very easy to see why this didn't get a series. Manhunter, edited, written, and drawn by Jack Kirby. This issue is focused on the origin of a new Manhunter, a lawyer known as Mark Shaw. It involves a secret society where the current Manhunter has gotten too old for his duties and a replacement is being sought. Shaw, who is trying to get justice for a client, assumes the role of Manhunter to hunt down and capture criminals. It's a pretty solid interpretation from Jack Kirby that would go unused until the late 80s. Afterwards, Manhunter's history would become part of Green Lantern mythology. Canonically, they were the first version of lanterns. As some might point out, there were 2 different Manhunters before this one, and there would be another one after that. Let's put it this way, Manhunter continuity is pretty messed up to begin with, and this wasn't the first Manhunter Kirby worked on for DC. Trying to explain this character's history could be its own lengthy rabbit hole video. As for this version, there was a lot of potential, and it probably should have gotten a solo series. But, as mentioned a moment ago, Kirby was practically done at DC. So that may be why Manhunter faded away until a later time. The Dingbats of Danger Street, edited, written, and drawn by Jack Kirby. The Dingbats are a group of street kids, all with their own unique identity, quirks, and street names. There's Good Looks, Non-Fat, Crunch, and Bananas. According to Kirby's regular inker, Mike Royer, Dingbats was supposed to be a series, but it never went beyond this one-issue tryout. The pages Kirby produced were repurposed for this issue of First Issue Special. Allegedly, 2 other issues were completely penciled, but were never used. So Kirby had put a lot of work into it, but DC wasn't impressed. Again, for the millionth time, Kirby's contract was almost over at this point, and DC seemed very ambivalent about Kirby material. As for the comic, this is a rather lighthearted story, with the Dingbats helping the police capture 2 oddball supervillains, Jumping Jack and the Gasser. This isn't as bizarre as the Green Team, but it is similar in the sense that it's a quaint, throwback look at street kids. One can't help but to think of Kirby's own Yancey Street Gang from the Fantastic Four and the Newsboy Legion from Jimmy Olsen. Possibly, these are all inspirations for the Dingbats. If there's any takeaway from these 3 issues done by Kirby, it's that he was very versatile, and honestly, he took a lot of chances, trying to find new ideas for a young audience. These concepts may not have connected, and probably would have been more popular a decade earlier, but these issues prove he still had a lot of juice in his creative engine. The Creeper, written by Michael Fleischer, illustrated by Steve Ditko. The Creeper battles the light-based villain, Firefly. Basically, it's another Creeper story that could have easily been part of the short-lived series from 1968. It should be mentioned, this is still the early version of the Creeper. When the reporter, Jack Ryder, transforms into the brightly colored superhero, they're basically the same person. The Creeper would evolve later to be more of an oddball split personality that was distinct from Ryder. Warlord, written and illustrated by Mike Grell. Travis Morgan is a pilot flying spy missions over Russia. During one mission, he is almost shot down, and he's forced to make an emergency landing in Alaska. As he flies over the North Pole, his instruments go crazy and his plane runs out of fuel. He has to eject, and he ends up parachuting into a strange, tropical landscape. He wanders, trying to find signs of civilization, before suddenly encountering a scantily clad woman fighting a dinosaur. So begins Warlord, a series about Travis Morgan who becomes a hero in this hollow Earth world. It's a basic sword and sandals premise, with a heavy dose of Edgar Rice Burroughs, but it still feels pretty fresh and interesting. It's no surprise, the comic became a long-running solo series after this, although it had already been approved to be a series before this issue was published. So it's a rare occasion for first issue special where a series debuted not as a tryout, but as an actual lead-in to an ongoing series. Dr. Fate, written by Martin Pascoe, illustrated by Walt Simonson. Dr. Fate fights the menace of the mummy, Callus. While this issue has some pretty stellar artwork from Walt Simonson, it's a reasonably standard Dr. Fate story. Perhaps the only notable thing is the mummy, Callus, would reappear later as a modern member of the Creature Commandos. It's not terrible, and it is very pretty to look at, but that's about it. Outsiders, written by Joe Simon, illustrated by Jerry Grandinetti. The Outsiders are a group of freaks that have joined to help other freaks of the world. There's Johnny Lizard, a human-lizard hybrid, Billy, a childlike person with a large, thick skull, Doc Scary, an alien-altered astronaut, Harry Larry, Ronnie, and finally, Mighty Mary, none of which get an origin story because, well, the story ran out of pages. The team is assembled by Doc Scary, and they live in a secret underground hospital or research facility. It's not made clear. It's a fast-paced story that reads a lot like a psychedelic fever dream someone had after reading a pile of Doom Patrol comics. It's almost too weird to believe. Like Brother Power the Geek, The Outsiders probably would have made a classic, highly confusing short series. For those wondering, other than the title, this bears no relation to the well-known Bat franchise version of The Outsiders. Codename Assassin, written by Jerry Conway and Steve Skeets, illustrated by the Redondo Studio. The Assassin is a telekinetic character looking to get revenge on the mob. After one group is arrested, the mob sends two supervillains after the Assassin, Snake and Powerhouse. The Assassin is actually Jonathan Stone, a man imbued with strange mental powers when a test of ESP goes horribly wrong. Then his sister is killed by the mob, and that trauma unlocks the full potential of his powers. He swears to get revenge, no matter what it takes. The issue ends on a cliffhanger with the Assassin confronting Snake and Powerhouse. Conceptually, it has some potential. Although, the Assassin does read like a light version of the Punisher and a rough draft of the future character, the Midnighter, both of whom can see a person's moves before they make them. Despite his name, the Assassin doesn't actually assassinate people. He uses tranquilizer darts, and he can debilitate any opponent with a mental blast. So, really, he's codename Incapacitator. Starman, written by Jerry Conway, illustrated by Mike Vosberg. Michael Thomas is a member of an alien race that has come to Earth to enslave the population. Michael disagrees with this plan and escapes in order to protect the world from the invading conquerors. It's not an overly compelling or original premise, and it bears some relation to Marvel's own Captain Marvel from the late 1960s. This version of Starman would fade away into obscurity until revived in James Robinson's excellent series from the 90s, which is all that really needs to be said about this character. Return of the New Gods, written by Jerry Conway and Denny O'Neil, illustrated by Mike Vosberg. This issue works as a revival of Kirby's New Gods series, but without Kirby's involvement. Basically, the war between New Genesis and Apocalypse starts again. All the main characters are reintroduced, but the story mainly focuses on Orion. When Jack Kirby returned to DC to write a finale to The Fourth World, this issue and the rebooted series that followed was entirely ignored by Kirby. So I have to admit, I'm unsure whether anything that happens is considered within continuity. Regardless, this reboot seems like DC admitting The Fourth World was a concept that still had potential and they had cancelled it before its time. Again, if DC's relationship with Kirby hadn't dissolved into bitterness, this would have been a perfect vehicle for Kirby to return to and continue where he left off. Instead, Kirby went to Marvel, and this New Gods revival would last only 8 issues before being cancelled again. Obviously, ranking these titles comes down to personal taste. For me, it came down to what was good, and then what was so weird it deserved at least a few more issues. Warlord deserves the top spot because it was literally a lead-in to a popular series. It might not have been an entirely original idea, but it did have an original modern spin to it. Even though it was only 20 pages, one can tell this is a concept with a lot of legs. Dingbats of Danger Street is next. There's just something charming and ridiculous about oddball teens taking on oddball supervillains. It reads like Kirby was enjoying himself, and maybe it was a good vehicle for him to poke fun at some of the tropes he had used through the years. Conceptually, Manhunter was a solid okay. It kind of has an OMAC energy to it, and it probably would have crashed and burned after 6 issues. But it was worth seeing where it would have gone. Outsiders is the first train wreck on the list that was so strange it deserved more. There was no way it would be successful because it was just too messed up. But of everything, it would have been the best, slow-moving disaster to witness, just like Brother Power and Prez. Lady Cop is the next pile of burning trash that would have been an embarrassing time capsule had it continued, and I wish it had for that very reason. Mixing street-level sensibilities with romance and female empowerment was just so tone-deaf it became too absurd for words. It's definitely an entry in the bad idea done poorly category. I seriously considered putting this in the top spot. It's something that has to be read for just how unreal it is. Codename Assassin had potential, it really did, but ultimately it was kind of tame. I don't know why exactly, but Green Team had some undertones that didn't sit well with me. There's just something off about the whole concept. Along the same lines, Atlas also seemed off to me. It read like something Kirby whipped up to hit his page quota that month, and he didn't really care about it. Everything else was bland. Not terrible, but not all that interesting. New Gods gets the bottom spot because it should have been Kirby reviving the series. Bringing it back without him was not cool. Not cool at all. So that's it. That's first issue special. It was a misguided experiment loaded with some equally misguided ideas. All that's left to say is thank you for watching, or listening, whatever the case may be. Thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and on YouTube. If you have the ways and means, please help out. I'm about a third of the way to my overall goal of being able to do this full time, so any and all support is greatly appreciated. Extra special thanks to Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrews, Corey Drew, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, Johnny Lim, Steve White, Taylor Dull, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient.